Alright, so in today's video I'm going to be going in depth with the Tascam M3700. I've actually done one of these videos before. It was just a quick walkthrough. It was never really intended for public consumption. It was just for anyone working out of the studio so that they would know the basics or understand the basics of the console. They wouldn't have to keep calling me up all the time. But it nevertheless got thousands of views and was one of the reasons why I decided to start this channel in the first place. So I thought I'd do a proper job this time, go in depth and even demonstrate where possible all the features of this console. Now, like I say, it is going to be quite in depth, so it may take more than one video to get through everything. But we'll start with part one, which will be the meter bridge and channel strips. Okay, so let's start with the meter bridge here. So we've got metering for all channels with the LED meters, and then on the end there we've got two VU meters for the outputs. Now we can switch what we would like to be metering with these little dip switches down here. We've got the inputs, the direct outs, the tape returns, and the subgroup channels. And the subgroup channels come up on the last 8 channels here, so we can switch between them using that switch and then meter the subgroup rather than channels 25 to 32. But under normal circumstances, 25 to 32 are metered just like all the other channels. So when you're metering using analog, you don't need to worry too much about going into the red. I'll just bring up some flashing LEDs for you here. So you can see some of them are going into the red. That's the kick and the snare there. Unlike digital, where digital going into the red is a big no-no, it's not such a big deal with an analog console. In fact, it might even sound good. You have to decide for yourselves on that one. But yeah, you don't have to worry too much when using analog about going into the red. Things that are quite percussive usually will sound better if you push them into the red a little bit. Okay, onto each individual channel now. You can see most of the buttons and switches are the same for every channel, but there are some different ones as we get to the end. I'll go through those later, but they are mostly the same for each channel. So the very first button we've got is a power button. So if the microphone input you're using requires phantom power, push that button. That's available on all 32 channels. The next button down is a pad. This is an attenuator, so if the signal that you've got coming in is quite hot, you're struggling to control it with the mic trim, you can press pad and that will attenuate the signal somewhat and help you bring it under control so you can better control it with the trim here. You've then got a line trim if you are using a line in instead of a mic in. If you're using the line in instead of the mic in, you would also have the line in button pushed. But in these cases we're using mic in, so we don't. The flip buttons. Now, all the channels have these flip buttons, and it's one of the most common reasons why someone would call me up saying, hey, there's no sound coming out of this console, what am I doing wrong? Usually you have your flip buttons configured in the wrong position. So what the flip buttons do is essentially flip the input between the microphone input or the tape return. So when you're recording, you want the flip buttons up, and when you're listening back, you want the flip buttons pushed down. So you're listening to the tape instead of the mic inputs. Okay, next button down is HPF, that's high pass filter. And this brings us nicely onto the EQs. So every channel has your 4-band EQ. You've got your 10K, your high mids, your high mid sweep, your low mids, your low mid sweep, and your low lows. And you can turn the EQs on and off using these buttons. These buttons, incidentally, are also automatable. So you can have the automation, turn those on, or turn them off at certain points during your mix if you so desire. We'll get onto automation later on because again that's quite in depth, but we'll just demonstrate some EQs for you. Just on the overheads here. So if we turn the 10Ks up, you hear those working. Your high mids, sweep those. Low mids. and your low lows. And those are your EQs on and off. Okay, and that brings us nicely onto the auxiliary and monitoring section. So we can send each signal from each channel to the auxiliary channels. You'll see we've got 1, 3, 2 and 4 are in pairs on these trim pots, 5 and 6 have their own. So to send it to signal to auxiliary 1, we turn that up. To auxiliary 2, we turn that up. If we want it to go to 3 and 4, we have to have that button pushed in. So with the button pushed in, it's going to 3 and 4, and with the button not pushed in, it's going to 1 and 2. You can also send that to the monitor mix or not, and have it post fader or not. We can also mute out those as well. So now this brings us to the actual monitoring itself. So it has quite a good monitoring capabilities. So we can monitor the inputs, pre-fader listen, and we can also mute these out as well, and we can create a nice monitor mix. Now we tend not to use that here because we're recording mostly the musicians playing at the same time in like a live setting, so we tend not to do too much with the monitoring mixes, other than when they're maybe recording to something else they've already done, or like multi-tracking some guitars or something like that, in which case usually just the stereo outs are fine. But you can create a nice monitor mix using these short faders here, and if you've got a musician that's particularly fussy and wants something in particular, you can put his on an auxiliary channel, or just send some things to an auxiliary channel and have him listening to those. You can also pan them. So if you really want a super nice monitor mix, you can add panning to it as well. Okay, now subgroups. So the next section is essentially where we want to send this signal. So at the moment it's going out to the left and right channels with the left L and R buttons pushed. So this is another common reason why I would get a phone call saying, hey, there's no audio coming out of this console, and it's because left and right outputs are not selected. So with left and right selected, that means the signal from this channel is going to the left and right stereo outputs of the desk. Now, if we wanted, for some reason, to send them to a subgroup, we can select the subgroups using these buttons. And you'll notice again, these are in pairs. Now the reason why they've done things like this by putting things in pairs is to make the desk more compact. I mean, by today's standards, it is quite a large console overall. But back in the day, this had the capabilities of a much larger console in quite a neat package, and they achieved it by doing things like this. So they've paired up the subgroups here. So we've got 1, 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. And then your left and right, and that means that the pan trim here has two functions. So if your left and right is selected, you're panning left and right, but if you have subgroups 1 and 2 selected, you're panning between odd and even. So left would be 1 and right would be 2, or if you've got 3 and 4, left would be 3 and right would be 4. And I will actually demonstrate this and a good reason for using it. So let's say if we've got a drum mix here, just turn these faders up, and we wanted to put the same reverb effect on the kick and the snare. So rather than running them both into two separate units, or running them both into the same unit and then take the signal back out of the unit again using the patch, we can actually just put everything that we want to have on that effects unit with that particular reverb on the same subgroup. So we can send the kick and the snare to subgroup 1. So on subgroup 1 at the moment, I've got patched in some reverb. So if I just play the kick and the snare for you now, going to left and right, you will hear it without any reverb. Okay, so now if we send this to subgroup 1, so we'll turn off left and right, and you'll now hear nothing is coming out. So if we select subgroup 1 and 2, subgroup 1 and 2, turn them both to the left to go to subgroup 1, and now we scooch on over to subgroup 1, bring the fader up for subgroup 1, and then the last 8 channel strips can be substituted for the subgroups, so we can control them on the channel strip. And you'll see the short faders also have a group button here, which is not on any of the others. So group button is pushed, that means this is now not a monitoring fader, it's for the group inputs. So if I turn that up, you'll hear we now have the kick and the snare with the reverb, and we can monitor that also on the meter bridge by pushing the group buttons, and you can see on the meter bridge there now. We are monitoring the combined kick and the snare from the subgroup. So that's what you would use a subgroup for. And now down to the main channel faders. Oh, sorry, I've just forgotten here. Underneath your pan trim, you've also got a solo and a mute button. So on the main channel fader, the first thing everyone notices is this bypass button. Now this bypass button tends to be a bit confusing. It does not mean that the channel is bypassed. The bypass is referring to the automation. So like I say, I'll go through automation in a separate part of this video, because it is quite an in-depth thing, but it just basically means it's bypassing the automation, because automation on this console is voltage controlled, so it can introduce a little bit of noise or raise the noise floor on each channel. So when you're recording, you would have the automation completely bypassed. You only need the automation if you're mixing, and you can select each individual channel whether to use the automation or not, and in which case you'd need it not bypassed. Again, the mode button, write and update, that is referring to the automation. You can write new automation or update, making changes to any current automation that's been saved. Like I say, we'll go through that in another video. And you've got the mute button for the main fader as well. Now this mute button is also automatable, so you can have channels turning on and off as you wish. Okay, now like I said, all the other channel strips are exactly the same as that one, with the exception of the last 8, because the last 8 you also have the functionality of controlling the subgroups with the last 8. So rather than having your short fader as a monitoring fader like I said before with your import or pre-fade listen, you can actually have it set to group. So if you set that to group there, then this then becomes the fader for subgroup 1. Okay, on to the master section. We've got the master fader here as well. This again, you can bypass the automation on it. You can automate the master fader, mute it and unmute it, and have all that automated. And then we've got the faders for the subgroups. Again, these can be automated. You can bypass the VCA automation, and you can write and update just as you can on all the other channel strips. Okay, now we've got the effects returns. So this console has some built-in effects returns. These are just inserts on the back of the console, and we don't actually use them because we have a separate patch bay. So we can literally patch things in on any channel we want. But if you just needed like a smaller setup, you could literally have, I don't know, like a reverb or a guitar pedal or something on the insert for effect 1, and then you can send that to any of the subgroups you like, and including the left and right output. You can also pan it, and again you've got the odd and even for depending on which subgroup you'd want that signal being sent to. And you can solo and mute them as well. Now we've got the auxiliary master trims. Whatever you're sending to auxiliary 1, you can turn it. You can send multiple channels to auxiliary 1 and control it using this. And then we've got the control room section. Now this is what you're listening to in a control room. So you can listen to just the auxiliaries. You can listen to EXT, that's external input. So there is a stereo input on the back of the console. If you wanted to plug something into there, like a CD player or another tape machine or something like that, you can just listen to the external input. And then you've got your 2-track out, so that's for your mastering to your 2-track tape recorder. But predominantly we just have stereo pushed, and that's listening in the control room to the main stereo outs. We've also got a pre-fade listen button, your solo trim tab, your pre-fade listen trim tab, your control room trim tab, and we can listen in mono. We can also dim the signal in the control room by about 30 dB. And the GoPro's just given up. Yep, and it's just died. Great. Again, you've got a selection for your metering here, so you can meter the studio outputs, the control room, or the main stereo out. We just generally have that on the main stereo out. Inside the studio, the signal that's going out there, and also the headphones. So you've got your studio trim tab there, your headphones. Your headphone jack is actually underneath, tucked away. You can listen in mono as well, or you can send the control room signal out to the main studio. So talkback talks back through your monitor mix. Slate talks back to everything, including the tape machine, so that would record what you were saying on the talkback mic on the tape machine. Or if you just want to talk to the fussy musician with his that you've put his mix on auxiliaries, you can just talk to him, and that's the level tab, the level trim for the microphone here for when you're talking back. So you can, if you've got a drummer who can't quite hear you, you can crank that all the way up. Okay, so I'll just demonstrate for you now how I would go about setting up a normal input. I've got a microphone plugged into channel 1. It's a dynamic mic. It doesn't require phantom power. It won't require attenuating either, so we don't need the power or the pad buttons pushed. However, we do need the flip button up because we want to hear the input on the channel and not the return from the tape machine. So, first thing we do, bring up the fader for channel 1. And now we're going to trim it using the trim pot. And we would bring it up until we see it going into the red. Now I'm not going to push it up too high because I'm standing right in front of the monitors with the microphone. You don't have to worry too much about it going into the red with analog, in particularly with percussive instruments. It can sound quite good. It also sounds quite good when you're recording to tape. If you hit the tape machine quite hard, it's not like a digital console where going into the red you will immediately be clipping. Incidentally, all the channels have these little overload lights on, so if you were clipping the input, the overload light would be flashing. There's also overload lights on the VU meters as well for your outputs, so it's worth keeping an eye on those. But you'll notice you've got loads of headroom, and going into the red, there's no problem at all when you're recording analog. In fact, in some cases, like I say, it might sound better, but you'd have to just decide for yourself on what you were recording in particular, and have a listen and see if you thought it sounded better pushing it quite hard, or maybe pulling back just under the red. But that's where you control that and watch it on your meters. So we don't need a high pass filter. I don't need to worry about EQing now. That's something I do at the mix, although you could EQ it if you'd like. I could decide at this point to send the microphone signal to auxiliary 1, or have it in the monitor section. We can also monitor the input here, and we've got a short fader if we were making a monitor mix. Like I say, we tend not to use the monitoring section because of the nature of what we're recording. We record a lot of stuff live, and even when they're multi-tracking, just multi-tracking to the stereo output, playback is usually fine. They don't need their own monitor mix, but the monitoring mixing capabilities of this console are very good. We could also decide at this point to send it to a subgroup. It's a good time to make sure that you've got the left and right outputs selected, because if you haven't, you won't be getting any output at all from this channel. And you've got your solo mute and overload lights there. So that's how I would go about setting up a standard input on the channel strip. Like I say, they're all the same. I go through the same process with all the other faders, bringing them all up and then bringing up the trim tabs until I'm happy with where we are on the meters. Once I've got that right, I then might adjust the mix using the faders. But we always start with the fader at unity or 0. Okay, so I think that just about covers the most of the buttons and switches for the Tascam M3700. I'll do the automation computer in part 2, so stay tuned for that.